Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, the place where the past whispers you into dreamland. Tonight, we're traveling back to the streets, homes, and privies of Victorian England. But not to marvel at tea parties or polished waistcoats. No, tonight, we're exploring the unwashed underbelly of the 19th century. From coal-dusted faces to chamber pots under the bed, from arsenic-laced face creams to overflowing cesspools, Victorian hygiene was a daily challenge. For the poor, filth was a fact of life. For the rich, dangerous beauty rituals and bizarre beliefs ruled the bath. With soothing narration and gentle detail, we'll uncover just how grim cleanliness could be. So, if you're ready to drift into a world of muddy boots, chimney soot, and unmentionable odors, snuggle under the covers, and let this calm journey guide you to rest. Let's begin by imagining a world without scented soaps, body wash, or even basic shampoo. In Victorian England, soap was a luxury and not one everyone used regularly. The average working-class family might have a single hard bar of libust soap, often used for laundry, dishes, and the occasional scrub of the hands. It was harsh, alkaline, and could burn sensitive skin. For many, it was simply unaffordable to use for regular bathing. Victorians, especially the poor, did not bathe every day. Far from it. Instead, cleanliness was often limited to what they called a dry wash. A cloth dipped in a bowl of cold water would be dabbed across the face, neck, and maybe the armpits, just enough to appear less filthy, not actually become clean. The richer classes, of course, had a bit more access. But even in grand townhouses, full-body bathing was rare. The wealthy might have had a tin tub in the bedroom, but hot water had to be carried in bucket by bucket, heated over a coal fire, one kettle at a time. Bathing was a production, and not something most people did more than once a week, often less. And the strangest part, many Victorians believed water was dangerous, that washing too often could let illness seep in through the pores. Some even feared that warm water could open the skin to disease. So hygiene was caught in a strange tension between health paranoia and genuine need. Now, close your eyes. Imagine you're in a dimly lit tenement room, the scent of coal smoke in the air. A single wash basin sits on the floor beside a cracked mirror. There's a knock at the door. Time to go to the factory. You wipe your hands on your apron, splash some icy water on your cheeks, and step out into the soot-covered street. Sleep comes easily in a world so heavy, so tired, and so grimly still. As the Victorian day began and ended, one object was nearly always close at hand. The chamber pot. Kept under the bed or in a corner cabinet, this humble ceramic bowl served as the toilet for most people, rich and poor alike, particularly during the long cold nights when leaving the house to use an outdoor privy or communal loo was an option. But here's the tricky part. Where did it all go? In the poorest tenements, chamber pots were often emptied directly into the street. A quick shout of "Garde, borrowed from the French regardus l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, might precede the splash of human waste onto the cobblestones below. If you were unlucky enough to be passing by, there was little you could do but duck and pray. More respectable homes had maids or night soil men who carried the contents away, often to cesspools or dumping grounds on the city's edge. But even in wealthier areas, smells lingered. Indoor plumbing was rare until the late Victorian period, so even nobles relied on commodes, slop jars, and chamber pots. In working-class areas, one communal privy might serve a dozen or more families. Imagine waiting your turn on a rainy night, your boots slipping in mud, the wind howling around you. No light, no paper, just a wooden seat, a shared bucket, and the hope that no one had been there too recently. In the summer the situation got even worse. Flies bred in cesspools, spreading disease to nearby kitchens and water sources. In the winter, things froze, which meant chamber pots had to be carried through icy streets to wherever they could be dumped. Occasionally, they simply overflowed. Close your eyes now. Picture a narrow alley, silent but for the drip of rain off crooked roofs. A tired man in a flat cap lugs a sloshing pail past shuttered windows, his boots crunching on frostbitten cobbles. No one sees him, no one thanks him. But this, too, is part of Victorian hygiene. Let your mind wander through the dim streets, the hidden routines, and the hush of lives lived in discomfort. Sleep waits in the quiet corners of forgotten history. And if you're enjoying these peaceful dives into the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It really helps keep the fire burning and the stories flowing. In the modern world, we take daily showers or baths for granted, but in Victorian times, the act of bathing, especially with warm water, was a privilege, not a habit. For most people, a full bath was a rare event, often weekly, monthly, or even less frequently. For the poor in London's East End or Manchester's crowded slums, there was no running water. Water had to be fetched from pumps or public fountains, carried up narrow staircases in heavy metal pails. Heating it required fuel, coal, wood, or peat, and that, too, cost money. So even when someone could find water, hot water was another matter entirely. Enter the concept of the dry wash, a cloth soaked in cold water, or, more often, just a quick wipe of the face and hands. This was considered sufficient by many Victorians. Some added a splash of vinegar or rose water to disguise odors, but as you can imagine, body odor was a constant presence, not an anomaly. Among the upper classes, things were only slightly better. Wealthier homes might have a tin or porcelain tub, rolled out and filled by servants, bucket by bucket. But even for them, bathing was not a daily affair. A proper lady might bathe once a week, perhaps more in summer, less in winter. Victorian doctors even warned against frequent bathing, believing it could weaken the body or lead to illness. The pores, they thought, opened during hot baths and allowed in dangerous vapors. Some physicians believed that too much cleanliness was unnatural and even morally suspect. They existed, but were not always pleasant. Shared tubs, tepid water, and the lingering residue of the person before you. Often these baths were just a quick dunk, scrub, and leave. No soaps, no shampoos, and certainly no candles or relaxing ambient. Now, as you lie in your clean bed, let the imagined steam of a tin bath rise in your mind. Set in a small kitchen, firelight flickering on cracked tiles. A woman gently lowers herself into the shallow water, flinching at its chill. Outside, horses clop past on cobblestones, and the scent of coal smoke drifts through a cracked window. In the hush of that image, let your thoughts soften, your breathing slow. The discomforts of the past are behind us, but for now they carry you gently towards sleep. As the gas lights dimmed and the fireplaces burned low, a very human need remained. What to do when nature called in the middle of the night? In Victorian homes, especially for those without indoor plumbing, which was most people, the answer came in the form of a humble object, the chamber pot, tucked beneath beds, inside nightstands, or hidden behind modesty screens. Chamber pots were essential nighttime tools. They were often ceramic, metal, or even enamel-lined, though the poor might have to make do with a simple tin can or bucket. There was no privacy. In a single-room home or tenement, you might be sharing space with multiple family members, children, grandparents, even boarders. Using the pot at night meant crouching behind a screen or just turning your back to those pretending to sleep. And what happened to the contents come morning? If you lived in the slums or lower-class neighborhoods, there was likely no flush toilet, no sewage system. The chamber pot was carried sometimes through narrow, overcrowded hallways, to be emptied into the backyard privy, the cesspit, or just tossed into the street. That's right, many still flung waste from upper windows, with only a shouted "God" as a warning below. Now imagine the stench on a warm summer morning. Hundreds of chamber pots emptied onto cobblestones, mixing with horse manure, rotting food, and industrial smoke. For wealthier Victorians, the system was more discreet, but no less grim. Housemaids were tasked with collecting and emptying the pots of the entire household each morning, a thankless chore made more unpleasant by heavy skirts, narrow stairs, and the ever-present risk of sleep. The chamber pot reminds us just how intimate and inconvenient Victorian life truly was. Even at its most refined, it lacked the hygiene and dignity we expect today. So now, as you rest, picture a flickering candle in a dim bedroom, the faint sound of coal settling in the stove, and a quiet clink as porcelain is tucked beneath the bed. The world outside is dark and cold, but here, in your own quiet space, you're warm, and far from the sloshing footsteps of the past. Breathe deeply and drift on. When we think of cleanliness today, we imagine warm showers, soaps with floral scents, and a daily rinse without a second thought. In Victorian times, however, bathing was a rare, arduous event, and for many it simply didn't happen at all. For the average person in a city like London, a full bath was a logistical nightmare. There was no running hot water, no bathtubs in the modern sense, and no privacy. To bathe you'd need to haul water manually, bucket after bucket from a well or a pump, then heat it over a coal or wood fire, and finally pour it into a metal or wooden tub. And that tub it was likely shared. The whole family often bathed one after another, using the same water, the father first, then the mother, then the children in descending order. By the end, the water was barely lukewarm, and not exactly clean. For those who couldn't afford coal or firewood, even this ritual was rare. Once a week, or even once a month, was considered reasonable for the poor. They might settle instead for a quick splash of water on the face, and hands a dry wash using cloth and vinegar, or just masking body odor with perfumes and powders. The wealthy had their own struggles. Even with staff, bathing was still inconvenient. Copper tubs were brought to bedrooms and filled by servants, who had to heat water in kettles over a fire again and again. Plumbing was primitive at best, and often only served a small portion of the house. Soap, too, was a luxury. It was often made from animal fat and lye, producing a harsh, caustic substance that irritated the skin. Mild soaps, scented ones, or soaps that foamed were expensive novelties. Poorer households might use homemade mixtures of ash, water, and sand, which were better suited for scrubbing pots than skin. Public bathhouses existed, but they weren't pleasant. They were crowded, dark, and in lower-class districts, notoriously unsanitary. There, you might find tubs of lukewarm, reused water and rows of strangers washing sides. The irony is, even though bathing was rare, the Victorians were obsessed with cleanliness, or at least the appearance of it. White linens were a marker of respectability. Lace gloves, stiff collars, and heavy skirts hid the body, and, often, its smells. People dusted themselves with powders, perfumes, and colognes, hoping to cover what baths could not. So tonight, while you lie in your clean sheets, think of the effort it once took to chase away the cold and the dirt, of the sighs as water cooled too quickly in the tub, of families crowded in small rooms, trying to stay clean in a world that was anything but. The past was heavy, even in its smallest comforts. But here, in the quiet now, you can simply rest. Breathe in, breathe out. You're clean, you're warm, and the bathwater will never run cold. If you've ever tiptoed down a dark hallway to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you might spare a thought for the Victorians, who had no such luxury. For them, nighttime relief came in the form of a chamber pot, a ceramic or metal bowl discreetly tucked under the bed or inside a wooden commode. There was no plumbing, no flush, just a cold, often smelly container that collected the day's or night's personal waste. Each morning, the pot would be emptied. If you were well off, a servant did this unpleasant chore, hauling the pot to the backyard or to a larger receptacle. If you weren't so fortunate, you did it yourself, possibly tossing the contents into a backyard cesspit, a gutter, or even straight into the street. Yes, human waste often flowed through city gutters, running down the sides of cobblestone roads, along with rainwater and animal droppings. The smell could be staggering. Streets were filthy, and during warmer months, the air grew thick and sour, especially in crowded urban neighborhoods. For those without chamber pots, the only alternative was the outdoor privy, sometimes called a necessary. These outhouses ranged from wooden huts behind rural homes to shared public facilities in city slums. They were often little more than planks over pits, with no ventilation, no cleaning, and no privacy. They reeked, a mix of human waste, rot, and mildew. Insects swarmed, especially flies, and rats were common. In many city homes, especially the overcrowded tenements, multiple families shared a single privy, which might only be cleaned once a month, if that. During cold winters, visiting the privy was an icy ordeal. During storms, it was muddy, slippery, and dangerous. And in places like London, where the water table was high, poorly constructed cesspits sometimes overflowed or collapsed, spilling waste into basements or wells. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery flourished under these conditions. The connection between filth and disease was just beginning to be understood. Of course, the upper class fared a bit better. Some grand homes had indoor water closets, early toilets with rudimentary flushing mechanisms, but these were finicky, prone to clogging, and connected to poorly designed sewage systems. One infamous example, the Great Stink of 1858, occurred when the River Thames became so overwhelmed with untreated sewage that the odor forced Parliament to suspend its sessions. Even royalty was not spared the indignities of hygiene. Queen Victoria herself used a decorated commode, essentially a fancy chamber pot, and her servants managed the daily routine of emptying it with discretion. Tonight, as you rest in quiet comfort, consider the creak of old floorboards in the dark, the chill of stone beneath bare feet, and the careful lift of a chamber pot's lid, the awkward shuffle to the privy, the way the night wrapped around them, just as it does around you now. But you don't have to move, just breathe. The air is clean, the room is quiet, and all your needs are far easier to meet than they were back then. Sleep is close. When you think of the Victorians, sparkling white teeth probably aren't the first image that comes to mind, and for good reason. Dental hygiene in the 19th century was rudimentary at best and excruciating at worst. To begin with, toothbrushes did exist, but they weren't what you'd recognize today. Most were made with bone or wood handles, and the bristles came from animal hair, typically boar. These stiff, coarse bristles were prone to falling out, and they didn't clean teeth very effectively. Still, if you were lucky enough to own a toothbrush, it was a prized possession, sometimes shared within families. Instead of toothpaste, Victorians used tooth powders, which could be homemade or these powders often included chalk, charcoal, crushed shells, or baking soda. Some even contained brick dust or powdered cuttlefish bone. While these ingredients may have scrubbed plaque, they also wore down enamel and made gums bleed. And there was no fluoride, of course. No real cavity protection. For the poor, even these tools were Many people simply used a cloth wrapped around a finger to wipe the teeth. Others chewed on twigs or used salt rubbed directly onto the gums. The result, tooth decay, was rampant. By middle age, many Victorians had missing or rotting teeth. Abscesses were common, painful, swollen pockets of infection that could spread to the bloodstream. In extreme cases, untreated dental infections were like if a tooth had to come out, and many did, there were few good options. Anesthetics were not widely available until later in the century. Many extractions were done without any pain relief at all, using forceps or pliers. In towns and cities, you might find a barber surgeon who doubled as a tooth, or a traveling tooth drawer who set up shop in the market square. Some wealthier Victorians replaced missing teeth with false teeth made from ivory, porcelain, or even other people's teeth, often stolen from the dead. There was an entire underground trade in cadaver teeth, sometimes referred to grimly as Waterloo teeth, harvested from soldiers killed in battle. And yet, smiling in public wasn't as expected or encouraged as it is now. Many portraits from the time show serious, closed-mouth expressions, not just due to the long exposure times of early cameras, but also because people were embarrassed by their teeth. So as you lie back tonight, warm and still, think of those who drifted to sleep in drafty rooms, their mouths sore and swollen, their toothbrush just a brittle bone with bristles. No electric toothbrush hum, no minty rinse, just a quiet resolve to get through another day and another night with what little they had. Rest comes easier now, doesn't it? In the stillness of a Victorian night, a pressing need might interrupt your rest. Not a knock at the door or a howling wind. For most Victorians, using the bathroom was a deeply unglamorous affair. Indoor plumbing was a luxury still reserved for the very wealthy. The average home, whether a city tenement or a countryside cottage, relied on far more primitive means. The chamber pot, this humble item, often made of ceramic or metal, lived tucked beneath the bed or hidden behind a curtain. At night, when the cold made stepping outside unbearable, the chamber pot served its purpose, filled quietly in the dark and then, if the user had the discipline, emptied at first light. Where was it emptied? Well, that's where the hygiene problem deepened. In urban slums, there were few privers and fewer sewers. Chamber pots were often dumped into cesspits in the backyard, or worse, tossed into the street gutters, a practice so common that cries of "Gardez low, French for watch out for the water," became an early warning for those walking below. Many Victorians simply stepped through sludge-filled alleyways and sidewalks awash with human waste, rotten food, and animal droppings. The result was more than just unpleasant, it was deadly. In London alone, over 200,000 homes relied on cesspools, which regularly overflowed, leaking into basements and wells. In poorer neighborhoods, public outhouses might serve dozens of families, overflowing, fetid, and rarely cleaned. Enter the night soil men, a vital but reviled profession. Under cover of darkness, these laborers would descend into pits and privers, shoveling human waste into carts for removal. The smell was unbearable, the danger considerable. Men occasionally suffocated from toxic gases, or slipped into the mire and drowned. But without them, the city would drown in its own filth, even faster. The waste, known as night soil, was often sold to farmers as fertilizer, and this system of informal recycling meant that even in the countryside, hygiene was never far from contamination. Wells for drinking water were sometimes only a few yards from the privy. It's no wonder that dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were constant, recurring plagues. It wasn't until the mid to late 1800s that cities like London began to address the crisis. After the infamous Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames reeked so horribly that Parliament was nearly evacuated, visionaries like Joseph Bazalgette designed enormous underground sewer systems. Triumphs of engineering that we still rely on today. But, for most Victorians, for the domestic servant in a creaking townhouse, for the dock worker in a crumbling flat, the bathroom remained a chamber pot under the bed, and a long, anxious walk to a reeking outhouse. So, tonight, as you drift off under warm blankets, in a room lit only by the flicker of imagination, give a sleepy nod to the unglorified truth of the past, that even the most basic act of relief was once a grim and filthy ritual. In the quiet morning hours of a Victorian household, before the clatter of kettles or the creaking of boots, you might find someone hunched over a wash basin. Ashes, to modern minds, dental hygiene seems like a straightforward routine. Toothbrush, toothpaste, rinse. But in the Victorian world, where science was still catching up to superstition and custom, the care of one's teeth was far less simple and far less pleasant. To start, toothbrushes were rare and considered luxury items well into the 19th century. If you were middle or upper class, you might have owned a brush, often with a bone or ivory handle, and bristles made from the stiff hairs of pigs or horses. These were not gentle instruments. They were rough, prone to falling apart, and often difficult to clean. Shared toothbrushes between family members were not uncommon, but most people didn't have a toothbrush at all. Instead, they used a cloth or their finger to apply homemade powders to their teeth, and those powders were a far cry from minty freshness. Common ingredients included crushed charcoal, brick dust, salt, baking soda, and even burnt bread. Some mixed in chalk or soot from the fireplace. The logic was simple. If it was abrasive, it might clean the surface. But these harsh materials stripped enamel and wore down teeth quickly. What looked white and clean often hid a slow decay beneath. For flavor and breath, a few added peppermint oil, cloves, or even a splash of vinegar. The poor often had nothing at all. And in working-class areas, where sugar was becoming more available, but education about its effects was non-existent, rotting teeth were the norm. Dentists, or what passed for them, were equally frightening. Barbers often doubled as tooth pullers, using unsterile pliers to yank offending molars from patients seated on wooden chairs, with little more than a swig of gin for pain relief. In towns and villages, traveling tooth drawers were common, setting up shop in markets and fairs. They were known less for their precision and more for their dramatic flair, waving bloody teeth in the air as proof of their work. For those who could afford it, dental innovation did exist. Vulcanized rubber dentures became popular by the late 1800s, replacing the earlier sets made from human teeth, often harvested from the dead, including soldiers on European battlefields. These were sometimes called Waterloo teeth, in grim reference to their origin. It's important to note that ideas about health and cleanliness were evolving during the Victorian period. The publication of health manuals, the rise of domestic science, and the beginnings of public health campaigns encouraged better oral care, at least among those who could afford to follow the advice. But for the vast majority, especially children and laborers, dental hygiene remained a painful and overlooked part of life. So as you let your eyes grow heavier, remember that even something as small as a toothbrush once marked the line between privilege and suffering, and that sweet pearly smiles were hard-earned, if not impossible, in the sooty world of Victorian hygiene. If you were living in a Victorian home, even a grand one, the chances are high that when nature called in the middle of the night, you wouldn't be heading to a flush toilet. Instead, you'd quietly reach beneath your bed and retrieve a chamber pot. These pots were as much a part of Victorian life as teacups or candlesticks. Made of ceramic, tin, or porcelain, they came in many sizes, some dainty and floral for ladies, others plain and They were kept in bedrooms, tucked discreetly into washstands or under bed. There was no privacy in the act, only modesty in how well you could pretend it didn't exist. Come morning, servants, often young maids, would carry these brimming vessels out to be emptied. In poorer homes, each family member might share one part, and it was often the youngest girl who had to handle the dirty task of disposing its contents. Where did it go? That depends on where you lived. In urban areas like London or Manchester, the contents of chamber pots were dumped into cesspools, gutters, or worse, the street outside. It was common for people to simply toss waste out of windows with a warning shout. God, this practice, especially in crowded slums, left the cobbled streets reeking of ammonia and human waste. This human refuse was known euphemistically as night soil. There were entire professions built around its collection. Night soil men, usually working after dark, would haul away human waste in carts and barrels, often up to their knees in the slop. The job was poorly paid but vital, and while reviled, these men were indispensable to a city's basic functioning. In wealthier areas, homes might have earth closets, essentially wooden cabinets, with a hole on top, filled with dry soil or ashes to mask the smell. Some homes had privers in the back garden, small, drafty wooden sheds with a seat over a pit. These, too, filled up quickly, especially in tenement housing. The flushing toilet as we know it did exist, but was a rarity. Early models were noisy, temperamental, and prone to freezing in winter. The famous Thomas Crapper helped popularize more practical models later in the century. But indoor plumbing was still decades away for the average person. In densely packed cities, the mixture of human waste and water runoff often ended up in rivers and wells, contaminating drinking sources and spreading diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. In 1858, the stench of untreated sewage in the Thames grew so foul during a heatwave that it shut down Parliament, an event remembered as the Great Stink. Public sanitation began improving slowly after that. The Public Health Acts, sewer reforms, and the pioneering work of people like Joseph Bazalgette began to modernize waste management in London and beyond. But the change was uneven, and most working-class neighborhoods still relied on overflowing privers or slop pails for decades to come. So as you drift into sleep, imagine a world where even the simplest act of relief was fraught with discomfort, indignity, and risk. A daily reminder that the modern toilet is one of the greatest luxuries history has to offer. If you're about to fall asleep, picture this. It's the chilly morning air of 1850s London. You step into your unheated bedroom washstand and reach for a rag, a bit of charcoal, or maybe some salt. Because for most Victorians, brushing your teeth as we understand it today was neither a daily ritual nor a guaranteed practice. Dental hygiene was still primitive, often homemade, and sorely neglected until the very late 19th century. Toothbrushes did exist. The modern bristle toothbrush had been around since the late 1700s, often made from boar's hair bristles attached to a wooden handle, but they were expensive and not widely used. Working-class families rarely had one at all. Instead, many people rubbed their teeth and gums with fingers, a chewing stick, or even a cloth soaked in vinegar or dipped in soot from the fireplace. As for toothpaste, that term didn't yet mean rows of minty gels and colorful tubes. People made their own concoctions using crushed charcoal, salt, baking soda brick, dust chalk, or powdered cuttlefish bone. These powders were harsh and gritty, enough to scrub off plaque, yes, but also tooth enamel. Some even added flavorings like cinnamon or peppermint oil to cover the bitter taste, especially in more upscale households. And what if your tooth ached? Well, the Victorian solution was often just to pull it out. Tooth decay was rampant, especially among the poor who now had more access to sugar than ever before thanks to cheap imports. Sweets, jams, and treacle puddings became common, but brushing didn't keep up with the times. The result, rotten, blackened, or missing teeth, was shockingly common. For those who could afford it, dentists did exist, but the field was still more trade than science. Dentistry was not regulated until 1878 in the UK. Before that, many barbers and blacksmiths simply added tooth pulling to their list of services. The idea of a sterile, bright dental office was a far-off dream. If you had money and wanted to preserve appearances, you might buy false teeth, sometimes made from ivory, porcelain, or even real human teeth sourced from grave robbers or the dead on battlefields. These grisly dentures were sold as Waterloo teeth, and were a morbid but prized accessory for the Victorian elite. It wasn't until the very end of the Victorian era, with the rise of modern chemistry and mass-produced toiletries, that toothpaste began appearing in jars and, eventually, tubes. Only then did brushing one's teeth each morning become a cultural expectation rather than a rare habit. So as your eyelids grow heavier and the modern hum of indoor plumbing surrounds you, remember that your soft toothbrush and minty paste are recent luxuries. For a Victorian, clean teeth were often a matter of luck or sheer grit. Imagine trying to stay clean in a world with no hot showers, no running taps, and no real privacy. That was the reality for most Victorians, especially those in working class or rural areas. The concept of regular bathing, even once a week, was a relatively modern idea that only gained social momentum partway through the 19th century. Before that, most people believed that bathing too often could make you sick. It was thought that exposing the body to water opened the pores to disease. As a result, many people washed infrequently, cautiously, and with great effort. So, how did they manage? Well, in the average Victorian home, there was no indoor plumbing. That meant water had to be fetched manually, either from a pump in the yard, a nearby stream, or a communal well. You'd carry heavy buckets inside, heat the water over a fire or stove, and pour it into a tin tub or a wooden basin. Entire families often shared the same bath, with the father typically going first, followed by the mother, then the children in order of age. It is where the old phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" comes from, because by the time the baby got in, the water was often too murky to see the bottom. For those without a bath at home, public bathhouses began to appear in larger cities in the mid-1800s, especially after the 1848 Public Health Act. These municipal facilities offered hot and cold water for a small fee, but they were still rare, and not always. Many poor families simply bathed once a week, often using only a basin, a rag, and a bit of soap for what was called a strip wash, cleaning only the face, hands, underarms, and private areas. Soap itself was not the pleasant, perfumed kind you might expect today. The cheapest soap was brown household lye soap, made from animal fat and ashes, and it was harsh on the skin. Luxury soaps, like Pear's soap, were heavily advertised to the middle class by the 1870s, but these were expensive and aspirational. And then there was the weather. During winter, bathing became almost impossible in cold, unheated homes. Water froze in basins. Fires had to be constantly stoked. Many people simply avoided washing until springtime. For the rich, things were more convenient, but not necessarily more frequent. Even noble families might bathe only once every few weeks, preferring instead to sponge off or use perfumes, powders, and fresh linens to simulate cleanliness. Bathing rooms were often ornate, with copper tubs, attendants to carry hot water, and delicate soaps, but they were more about comfort and status than true sanitation. In fact, Queen Victoria herself was known to be suspicious of frequent bathing, especially during pregnancy. Doctors sometimes advised against it. So as you cozy up under clean sheets, warmed by central heating and lulled by the promise of warm showers tomorrow, consider how exhausting and rare basic cleanliness was for the average Victorian. Hygiene was a privilege, not a given. Now imagine this. It's the middle of a cold, damp night. You're in a creaky Victorian tenement, 5 flights up, no gas lighting, and the only bathroom is a wooden shack in the backyard, shared by every family in the building. So what did people do? They used chamber pots. Every household, rich or poor, kept some form of a chamber pot under the bed. These were ceramic, metal, or enamel bowls used as nighttime toilets, especially during cold winters or for women and children. Come morning, the contents of the pot were dumped, ideally into a backyard privy, but just as often into the street gutter or into a communal set. The working class, poor in cramped urban slums, often didn't even have a backyard privy. In many parts of London, Manchester, and Glasgow, several families shared a single outdoor toilet, if there was one at all. These privies were basic wooden seats with a hole perched over a set. There was no flushing, no water, and very little privacy. Some families resorted to earth closets, toilets where dry earth was thrown on top of the waste to keep down the smell. Others just emptied their pots directly into open gutters or into the street, a practice so common that people walking below upper-story windows risked being splashed by filth. In places like Edinburgh was your only warning. The result, cities reeked. The stench of rotting waste, urine, spoiled food, and coal smoke blended into what Victorians politely called miasma. The air was thought to spread disease, which, ironically, was only half. Germ theory wasn't widely accepted until later in the century, but the filth itself did pose a real hazard. Open sewage seeped into water supplies. Rats, flies, and bacteria thrived. Some homes, especially in the countryside, relied on cesspools or simply dug holes in the ground. But without proper emptying, these would overflow and seep into cellars or wells. That's how cholera and typhoid spread so rapidly, often wiping out entire neighborhoods. The night soil men were the unsung heroes of the era. Workers who collected human waste from privies and cesspits during the night, hauling it away in barrels or carts. It was grueling, foul, and dangerous work. Often, they did it in secret, before dawn. They were paid poorly but depended upon for sanitation in a world without sewage infrastructure. For wealthier Victorians, things were only marginally better. Some upper-class homes had indoor water closets, especially by the late 1800s, porcelain toilets that flushed using a cistern of water. But even these required careful plumbing and drainage. Without proper traps and ventilation, the foul gases from the sewer would rise back into the home, causing illness and unbearable odor. It was until Joseph B's revolutionary sewer system in London that the situation began to improve for major cities. His underground tunnels helped carry waste far away from urban areas, transforming public health and sanitation forever. But that was the exception, not the rule. For most Victorians, especially before the 1870s, going to the toilet was an act of patience, planning, and a strong stomach. In the dead of night, on a bitter winter morning, many would rather use a pot than brave the rats, mud, and cold that waited outside. A clean, private toilet, just steps from your bed, would have felt like an unimaginable luxury. Bathing in Victorian times was not what we'd recognize today. Running hot water, a private bathroom, daily showers, those were fantasies for nearly everyone, regardless of class. For the poor, bathing, if it happened at all, was an ordeal. There was no indoor plumbing in most working-class homes, no tap to turn, no drain to empty, and certainly no dedicated bathroom. So what did people do? They heated water by hand, bucket by bucket, over a coal or wood fire. Once enough was hot, it was poured into a tin or wooden tub, usually placed in the kitchen or near the hearth. The entire family might share that same tub of water. The oldest or most important family member would bathe first. Usually the father, then, one by one, the rest of the family would climb in. By the time the youngest child took their turn, the water was likely murky, lukewarm, and full of soot and soap scum. For many working families, this ritual didn't happen every day. It didn't even happen every week. A weekly bath was the goal, but often it was a luxury. In industrial towns where coal dust, sweat, and filth coated every surface, people made do with quick sponge baths, wiping face, hands, and feet with cold water. Full body washing was simply too expensive, too complicated, and too cold to do regularly. There were public bathhouses introduced in the mid to late 80s, especially in industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham. These offered hot baths for a fee. Poor families might save up to visit once a month. The bathhouses were gender segregated and came with strict rules about cleanliness and behavior, but they were seen as a moral good, a way to cleanse both body and soul. The upper and middle classes had more options, but they weren't necessarily cleaner. In wealthier homes, portable bathtubs were wheeled into bedrooms or dressing rooms. Servants hauled in hot water in jugs and pails. The bath was drawn by hand, and servants were expected to empty it the same way. Water closets and plumbed baths began to appear in upper homes by the 1870s and 1880s, but even then, daily bathing was considered unnecessary, even unhealthy. Doctors warned against overbathing, fearing that hot water might weaken the nerves or damage the constitution. A good scrub once or twice a week was thought to be perfectly sufficient. Soap was another issue. The poor often used homemade lye soap, which was harsh and smelled faintly of animal fat or ash. Commercial soaps were available. Pears soap, for instance, became wildly popular by the end of the century, but they were expensive. Soap was taxed heavily until the mid-1800s, and many families used it sparingly. Scented waters, vinegar washes, and colognes were used as substitutes, especially by the wealthy. In fact, many Victorians preferred to mask odor with perfume rather than eliminate it altogether. Cleanliness was a sign of morality, but achieving it took labor, money, and planning. The idea of hopping in a warm shower every morning, scrubbing with fragrant gel, and toweling off in a heated bathroom would have felt like a fantasy novel to most Victorians. Instead, they made do with cold basins, gritty soap, and a steadfast belief that a little dirt never hurt anyone. If you've ever wondered how Victorians handled body odor, the short answer is, they mostly didn't. Deodorant as we know it today. Those neat little sticks, sprays, and roll-ons simply didn't exist. The science of sweat glands and bacteria wasn't well understood, and body odor was a tolerated part of life, especially among the working class. people stank, and everyone knew it. Instead of preventing odor, most efforts were aimed at covering it up. For the wealthier classes, that meant perfumes, not the light, floral scents you might picture, but thick, cloying fragrances, musks, attars, and strong floral waters, like lavender or rose oil. Ladies might dab scented handkerchiefs under their arms or tuck fragrant sachets into their corsets. Men splashed on cologne, sometimes so liberally it became its own source of offense. Those who couldn't afford commercial scents might rely on vinegar-based washes, herbal rinses, or even baking soda or alum powder to mask or absorb sweat. These remedies were often homemade and passed down through families. In some cases, people would rub lemons or vinegar into their armpits, believing the acid would neutralize odor. Spoiler, it didn't work very well. But beyond masking, many Victorians believed that sweating was healthy. Perspiration was seen as a natural way of ridding the body of toxins, especially before the rise of germ theory. And since undergarments absorbed most of it, as long as you changed your linen regularly, you were considered hygienic. For poorer folks, however, even basic linen was hard to keep clean. Washing was labor-intensive and expensive, so odors lingered. And in the crowded slums of London, Leeds, or Glasgow, stench became the background noise of life. In public spaces, smells collided: coal smoke, horse manure, rotting food, and sweat, all jumbled together. It was so bad that newspapers frequently complained of the effluvia of the unwashed in workhouses and tenements. But little was done. Interestingly, by the late 19th century, as advertising and personal grooming industries grew, early commercial deodorants did begin to appear, mostly in the United States, with products like Mum and Everdree marketed as antiseptic creams. But in Victorian Britain, these were barely known, and because of strict Victorian taboos around the body, talking openly about sweat, armpits, or odor was considered crude. Instead, people simply bore it in silence, perhaps tossing a bit of lavender into their drawers and hoping for the best. It's strange to think that in a society obsessed with appearance and morality, smelling awful was simply part of the human condition. But in the shadows of gas lamps and corseted drawing rooms, even the daintiest lady probably smelled a little ripe. In modern life, a daily shower is routine, almost taken for granted. But in Victorian Britain, bathing was not a daily affair. In fact, for many, it was a rare and laborious event. For the lower classes, especially in crowded cities, bathing was more a fantasy than a habit. Tenement houses didn't have bathrooms. Running water was a luxury, and hot water required fuel, usually coal or wood, both of which cost money. So when did people bathe? For most, once a week, if that was standard. Saturday night was often designated as bath night, a ritual that involved filling a large metal or tin tub, usually in the kitchen, where the hearth could warm the water. But heating enough water took time, and water had to be carried in by a bucket from a communal pump or if you were lucky, your family had a dedicated hip bath, a shallow, rounded tub you could sit in. Otherwise, you made do with whatever vessel was available. Entire families often shared the same bathwater, beginning with the father, followed by the children in descending age, and finally the mother, in what was by then tepid, murky water. It's no wonder the phrase "Dante throw the baby out with the bathwater" found relevance in this era. Soap was another factor. It was expensive, especially early in the century. Most working-class people used lye-based or carbolic soaps, which were harsh on the skin and left a powerful, almost medicinal smell. These were intended more for removing grime than for a pleasant bathing experience. Luxurious, perfumed soaps existed, but were reserved for the wealthy, often gifted or displayed rather than used. Among the rich, bathing became fashionable by the mid to late 1800s, thanks in part to the growing influence of Victorian-era health movements and an obsession with cleanliness as moral virtue. Wealthy households might have a bathing room, often featuring a plumbed-in bath. Still a novelty. Hot water was pumped from a boiler, but even here, bathing was usually twice a week at most, and servants often did the heavy lifting. There were also public bathhouses, facilities built by philanthropists or local governments to encourage hygiene among the working class. These were more common in industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham by the mid-1800s. But even here, a bath cost a small fee and was sometimes reserved for the truly desperate. Curiously, some Victorians believed too much bathing was unhealthy. Overwashing could open the pores, they argued, making the body more vulnerable to miasma, foul air believed to spread disease. Others thought hot baths sapped one's vital energy or tempted immoral thoughts. Thus, even when baths were accessible, they weren't always embraced. So next time you hop into a hot shower, think of a Victorian family passing around a bucket of soapy water, or huddling in the kitchen as the kettle boiled, preparing for what was likely their only bath that week. Imagine waking in the dead of night in a cramped London flat. There's no indoor toilet. The air is cold, and the stairs creak beneath you. You don't want to leave your bed. What do? For most Victorians, rich and poor alike, the answer was simple and unglamorous. The chamber pot. These ceramic or metal bowls, kept discreetly under the bed, were a household necessity. Used during the night and often first thing in the morning, chamber pots were emptied into larger containers or down communal waste channels. Some homes had dedicated slop buckets, kept in cupboards or tucked into what. In wealthier homes, a maid or chamber servant would quietly carry it away after morning calls. But for the working class, and particularly for tenement dwellers, the process was less discreet. Pots were often emptied out of the window, sometimes with little warning. This was before the enforcement of strict waste disposal laws, and urban areas like Whitechapel or Southwark became infamous for the phrase "Gardez," a French-inspired shout meaning "look out below." Before human waste was tossed onto the street, by day, streets were littered with the remnants of this casual disposal. Rain turned the mess into rivers of filth, and in summer, the smell became nearly unbearable. The infamous Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames reeked so powerfully it disrupted Parliament, was the result of decades of waste accumulation and poor sewage management. So who cleaned it all? Enter the night soil men, silent laborers who crept through cities while the world slept, emptying cesspits, privis, and waste barrels. Their work was physically demanding, thankless, and extraordinarily foul. Covered in filth, they worked by lantern light, hauling heavy loads through alleys and streets. Yet without them, the cities would have drowned in their own Night soil was often transported out of the city and sold to farmers as fertilizer. This gave rise to entire networks of waste economies, a grim but efficient loop. By the mid-19th century, the development of the water closet, a forerunner to the modern toilet, began changing things. Inventors like Thomas Crapper popularized flushing mechanisms, and sanitary reformers like Edwin Chadwick pushed for municipal sewage systems. But these were slow to implement and often reserved for the wealthy. For most Victorians, well into the 1870s, the chamber pot remained a nightly companion, and the night soil men, ghost-like figures of the urban underworld, were essential to city survival. So as you settle in tonight, remember, once upon a time, peace and quiet were interrupted by a clatter under the bed and the distant shuffle of boots hauling buckets of filth through gaslit alleys. In the modern world, laundry is a simple chore. Press a button, add some detergent, and wait. But for the average Victorian, washing clothes was an ordeal, backbreaking, exhausting, and often as dirty as the garments themselves. For working-class families, laundry day was often once every 1 or 2 weeks, sometimes even longer. Clothing was too precious to wash casually, and many owned only 1 or 2 sets. So when it came time to clean them, the entire household, especially women, would spend a full day, or several, wrestling with dirt, soap, smoke, and steam. The process began with sorting. Whites, darks, linens, undergarments, everything had to be soaked, usually in cold water overnight. This wasn't out of preference, but necessity. Water had to be carried in manually, heated over coal or wood fires, and poured into massive tubs or copper kettles. Next came the scrubbing and boiling. Lye soap, harsh and caustic, was used in place of modern Women would scrub garments on wooden washboards until their hands were raw and red. If the clothes were stained, they might be rubbed with sand, ashes, or even urine. Yes, human urine, due to its ammonia content, was historically used as a stain remover and fabric softener. After scrubbing, whites were often boiled in cauldrons or copper pots. The boiling not only cleaned but also helped kill lice, scabies, and other unpleasant critters that took up residence in seams and cuffs. And then came the bluing process, adding a hint of blue dye to yellowed or graying white fabrics to make them appear cleaner. This is where the phrase Blurance Brigade later came from, referring to older women who favored the bluing technique even for their hair. Rinsing the clothes was another ordeal. Clean water was hard to come by, and it took gallons to rinse away the soap and boiling residue. Everything was wrung out by hand or through a mangle, a set of heavy rollers cranked by hand to squeeze out excess water. Drying wasn't easy either. If you were lucky, you had a back garden or line to hang laundry, but many hung clothes indoors, over ranges, on rafters, or near windows, where soot, smoke, and city grime could undo hours of labor. In damp weather, it might take days for a single sheet to dry, and when all was said and done, everything needed ironing. With heavy they cooled quickly and had to be reheated constantly. Too hot, and they scorched the fabric. Too cool, and they were useless. By the end of laundry day, women were often sore, blistered, and soaked. The scent of lye and steam lingered in every corner of the house. Yet for all the effort, clothes never smelled fresh the way we imagine today. In fact, clean Victorian clothes often still carried a trace of smoke, sweat, and coal dust. Laundresses, women who took in washing for others, were known for their strength, their quick hands, and often their short tempers. It was a brutally competitive profession, and accidents were common. Boiling water scalded arms, irons left burns, soap burned skin. So the next time your machine spins quietly in the background, remember the hiss of the copper boiler, the crack of the Mongol, and the hands that worked until they bled just to make shirts wearable again. In the 19th century, public health became an obsession among Victorian reformers, but not necessarily for altruistic reasons. While the wealthy fretted over cholera and typhus spreading from slums, they also associated bad smells with moral decay. In their eyes, unwashed bodies weren't just unhygienic, they were immoral. This led to a movement that aimed to civilize the poor by washing them. Quite literally, by the mid-1800s, cities like London, Liverpool, and Manchester began building public washhouses and bathing facilities for working-class citizens. They were intended to offer poor families a clean, affordable place to bathe, wash clothes, and learn habits that were deemed respectable. But these facilities were a mixed experience. Most bathhouses were segregated by class and gender, with a hierarchy even among the working poor. Better rooms, longer baths, and warmer water often went to those who could pay a little more. The poorest were shuffled into drafty, plain cubicles, where they had a set time, sometimes just 10 to 15 minutes, to strip down, wash up, and get out. Soap and towels weren't always provided, and the water might already be murky from prior use. Still, for many, the public bathhouse was a blessing. It offered hot water, which was often unavailable at home, especially in urban slums with no plumbing. Some even saw it as a social outing, women bringing children, catching up with neighbors, sharing tips on laundry and stain removal. The rise of slipper baths, small cubicles where individuals could rent a tin or porcelain tub filled from a nearby boiler, became a modest luxury. Named for the slipper-like shape of the tub, they provided just enough room for an adult to crouch, soak, and scrub away the week's grime. But bathhouses also became sites of surveillance. Attendants monitored how long you stayed, how much water you used, and whether you seemed proper enough to return. Reformers often hovered, offering moral lessons alongside soap and water. Cleanliness was seen not just as hygiene but as proof of moral reform, especially for women. And yet, even these efforts couldn't keep up with urban poverty. In many parts of London, families of 6 or more shared a single room, and bathtubs were unheard of. A tin basin in the corner, or a rare trip to the public bath, had to suffice. In wealthier neighborhoods, private bathrooms were slowly becoming fashionable, but still rare. Even into the late 19th century, many upper-class homes only had one bathroom, if that, and water heaters were inconsistent, often coal-fired and prone to going out without warning. So while public baths were a small step forward, they didn't solve the core problem. Hygiene was still a privilege. Cleanliness required time, money, and access. All things in short supply for most Victorians. Still, the public bath movement laid the foundation for the future. By the early 20th century, baths became more normalized, but during the Victorian era, bathing remained a public act, a social statement, and a complicated dance between shame, necessity, and survival. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world began to shift beneath the feet of the Victorian everyman and everywoman. Cities grew taller, streets a bit cleaner, and, slowly, so did people. But Victorian hygiene didn't vanish overnight. The dirt, the smells, the daily struggle to stay clean, these lingered like coal smoke in the winter air. Even in the wealthier parts of society, indoor plumbing remained a novelty. Those grand homes with polished staircases and velvet drapes often had chamber pots under beds, and relied on servants to haul water for bathing. The idea of running water, flushing toilets, and hot baths at the turn of a tap, that was a dream still decades away for most. For the working class, hygiene continued to be dictated by time, space, and survival. Most people still lived cheek to jowl with neighbors, sharing privies, water pumps, and the occasional bar of communal soap. Public bathhouses helped, but bathing was not yet a daily habit. In fact, weekly washing was considered more than enough for many. But change was underway. Medical understanding had advanced, even if it lagged behind in practice. Germ theory had taken hold by the 1880s, and doctors now preached hand-washing, ventilation, and sterilization. Schoolbooks and pamphlets taught children the value of soap and fresh air, planting the seeds of modern sanitation. The invention and mass production of soap, toothpaste, and personal grooming tools made hygiene more accessible. And with the rise of advertising came a powerful new force: shame-based marketing. Ads warned of halitosis, body odor, and unclean appearances, especially for women. Cleanliness, once a luxury, became a moral imperative and a commercial opportunity. By the early 20th century, the legacy of Victorian hygiene had morphed into something new, a culture obsessed with purity, scent, and scrubbing away the past. But what remained, even as hot water and toothbrushes became common, was a deep cultural memory. The lingering discomfort of a time when staying clean was hard, and being dirty wasn't a choice. It was a way of life, and perhaps that's what makes Victorian hygiene so fascinating to revisit. It reminds us just how far we've come, and how much we still take for granted. So as you lie back and drift into sleep, let the fog of coal, smoke, and lavender oil settle around you one last time. Picture a flickering gaslight, the hush of a quiet parlor, and the distant sound of a water pail sloshing down the stairs. Somewhere, a maid is scrubbing a copper tub, a barber is heating a straight razor, a child is holding their nose as the privy creaks open. And in all that discomfort, there is a strangely comforting truth. Humans have always longed for cleanliness, and often suffered to reach it. Thank you for joining me on this soothing yet unsanitized stroll through history. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to Boring History for sleep. And sleep well, knowing that your bathroom is, blessedly, not Victorian. Good night.